President Cyril Ramaphosa addressed the nation on Sunday about vaccinations and assured South Africans that no one would be forced to vaccinate, but more and more employers are forcing employees to choose between their jobs and vaccinations with the new vaccine or leave attitude. But will vaccination passports be allowed and justified to be used within the workplace? Tonight we unpack the vaccination passports and the rights of employers and employees within the workplace with regards to vaccinations. Joining us in that conversation, the General-Secretary of COSATU, Bheki Ntshalintshali, mathematical epidemiologist Farai Nyabadza, Tibor Szana, who is the Chief Inspector at the Department of Employment and Labor, as well as the National Director with Lawyers for Human Rights, Wayne Ncube, with us tonight. You are part of the conversation on WhatsApp 072-110-5584, or you can tweet us tonight at Newzroom 405. First, though, let's have a look at what the President said.
No one should be forced to be vaccinated. Instead, we need to use the available scientific evidence to encourage people to be vaccinated, to protect themselves, but also to protect people around them.
That was President Cyril Ramaphosa a couple of days ago. But, of course, on Sunday, we heard the President saying now they are investigating some innovative ways, including the vaccine passport as one of the ways to encourage more vaccinations in the country. Let's begin with, of course, that particular conversation first and just get a sense. Is the President at least signaling or indicating a pivot as far as government position is concerned when it comes to the mandates on vaccines? Tibor?
Sorry, the line's very bad.
Is this an indication from government that they are taking a pivot when it comes to their position on vaccine mandates?
Look, I think, firstly, thank you very much for the opportunity. And when it comes to the vaccination issue, from our perspective as the Department of Employment and Labor, we are going to implement the processes that are mentioned in the fourth direction that was published by the Minister of Employment and Labor on the 11th of June 2021. We are not going to look at any other aspect. There's nothing in our legislation with regard to any passport or anything like that. So there are certain processes, and we will look at that with regard to employers who need to implement the direction. Vaccination, as it is recorded, requires the employer to follow certain processes, and those processes are clearly set out. One of the points I think that one needs to be cognizant of is that there are three very specific criteria for when an employee refuses to be vaccinated on any constitutional medical grounds.
Yeah.
The employee should be cancelled, and also if they, point B to that would be that if there is a need for medical evaluation, that should take place. And the third point to that is that the employer must then seek to allow the employee to work, let's say, off-site, if they can reasonably accommodate the employee by doing so. So
right.
those are the criteria.
So that position in June, as articulated by the Department of Labor, finds that you need, at least in the workplace, find a reasonable resolution. However, placing a premium on public health imperatives, and you're saying it's a risk-adjusted strategy where risk assessment must be done, and when you've discovered where the highest risk is, get that employer or employee at least to understand that they're at a high risk in the position that they are in, and therefore take the decision whether to vaccinate or not.
This matter of vaccination is concerned.
And is that the position that you think would be kind of the gateway to opening up the economy and getting rid of the lockdowns?
I think when we go back to the direction that has been published, again, the employer will have to prove that processes have been followed, and part of that procedure includes consulting with the trade unions, consulting with the health and safety representatives, and then also the employer has a duty to inform workers what is happening. So after a risk assessment has been done, there is a requirement for the employer to draw up a plan and then to ensure that that has been thoroughly discussed with the workers. And in that plan, obviously, they're going to clearly state what the position of the company is insofar as vaccinations are concerned. And then we go back to the three criteria that are listed for you.
Bheki Ntshalintshali, are the government, or let me say, it's government taking the easy way out here, leaving the corporations to make the decision? I mean, there's no legislation, of course, in South Africa currently that, or at least adequate legislation that tells us how we should approach this issue of vaccine mandates. And they are pretty much leaving the corporations to come up with a policy instead of putting their heads on the block.
No, good evening. Thank you very much. Let me just apologize that I was switched off. I lose the connection at the beginning, so I miss your introduction. But coming to your question, indeed, I think the government is putting its hand in the sand, hoping that the private sector should be leading, which is something that we don't agree, we don't endorse at all. That is left to the private sector to do as they deem fit and with different approaches. Government, if really they want this issue, which we oppose, of course, to the mandatory vaccination, they should come quite openly so that we can be able to engage.
Now, when you look at what's happening globally in the world, you can count countries: Russia, Canada, Australia, Britain, France, Italy, the US, even some other smaller countries. More and more countries beginning to somewhat either make vaccines mandatory or at least weekly testing to be something that would be something that is done in order for you to gain access even to social events and to some government buildings and places of employment. Have we reached a tipping point, considering that only 17% of adults in the country have actually agreed to be vaccinated, that we are actually at a point where if we want to see a decline in the number of people who get severely ill and hospitalized, we are going to have to look at vaccine mandates?
Look, we're of the view that South Africa has not done what is required to encourage people to vaccinate. If you look to the other countries, they are over 60 to 70% without any mandatory or forcing people to vaccinate. They have been on a route to motivate people to vaccinate. We should be able to separate what other countries are doing in order just to protect their economy and to blacklist other countries for various reasons. And those countries, if you take Britain for an example, we have not come across that they have put mandatory vaccination to their own citizens. So we should not adopt what other countries are doing for particular reasons and in the competition, for global competition economically and whatever they are doing. We should be doing our own issues and encourage people to vaccinate. We're backwards. We're backwards in terms of just taking the vaccination to our people, and just to encourage people to be hesitant and resisting vaccination, we think is the wrong route to take. More particularly, if you leave this thing to the employers who, for all of a sudden, they indicate to have an interest to the protection of workers, when in fact, during the lockdown, only about 40% were even compliant to the health and safety condition. So we don't buy this approach.
Farai, if we look at, of course, the numbers and the facts, medical facts around taking vaccines, is that we cannot debate and argue, right, with employees to say, well, get vaccinated, then you won't get the virus, right? You will still catch an infection. But we also cannot, with certainty, guarantee herd immunity. And so how do we then justify the health imperatives and say, well, you've got to take this because it's for public good?
Thank you, Tabo, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this this discussion. From where I stand as a mathematical epidemiologist, one of the things that we have seen with respect to this particular epidemic or pandemic, let's put it that way, is a pandemic that is quite dynamic. And because it has been quite dynamic, in many cases, governments are found trying to get people to get vaccinated one way or the other. And this is where you begin to have quite a lot of information that goes around, some of it positive, some of it that is actually negative. And, you know, the unfortunate thing is that in many cases, it is the negative information that sort of like spreads faster than the positive information. And in this particular case, with respect to vaccination, in my own view, it is for the common good. It is actually for the good of everyone, given that the vaccines themselves have actually proven in some of the many of the other countries that they have actually been doing good in not only reducing the infection, but also preventing severe cases and hospitalization at the same time, which in turn will certainly reduce our mortality or our fatalities and also reduce transmission. And in this particular case, certainly the government is found on the edge of trying to encourage people to get vaccinated. And in many cases, sometimes it comes with some form of resistance, unfortunately.
But the question then, Farai, is whether or not vaccine mandates will help us to reduce the risk of further transmission and the number of deaths that possibly could spike even in the pending fourth wave.
Sorry, come again, Tabo?
I'm saying the question is whether vaccine mandates could certainly help us reduce the risk of further transmission and further spike in deaths with the pending fourth wave that is being talked about.
You know what? Indeed, it's from, you know, scientific evidence. It so suggests certainly that these vaccines will certainly reduce mortality and will reduce some spiking. And one of the things that research has shown is that when we look forward to the fourth wave that people have talked about, one would certainly see that it will also depend on how much or how many people have actually been vaccinated at the present moment. And it remains part of the things that certainly government is, you know, trying to push for, to actually get people vaccinated at all costs. And apparently some of it then certainly, you know, conflicts with the constitutional rights of individuals to choose whether they want to be vaccinated or not. But certainly there is overwhelming evidence that certainly we will have some huge benefits if we vaccinate.
When we continue, we look exactly at that with Wayne Ngube. Is there justification under Section 36 to limit the rights which are in Section 12 as well as Section 13 of the Constitution with the implementing of vaccine mandates? We're back with you now tonight here on In Focus, Newzroom Afrika, Channel 405, as the conversation around vaccine passports is continuing, and the debates around whether or not this is the right time to take this step to ensure a fully vaccinated country, but not only that, a fully vaccinated workforce in order for us to get the country working again. Wayne Ngube, before the break, I said, of course, the courts have not yet had an opportunity to ventilate on this particular matter, but I suppose the biggest issues would be around whether or not there is justification for the limitation under Section 36 of the Section 12 rights, which include the right to bodily and psychological integrity, which, I mean, on face value, it does say that, therefore, you need to have a right to to choose which medical procedures you will undergo and which experiments you'll be allowed to be done on you. However, we all know that the Constitution is not read directly like that. Of course, there are other issues that come into play here. Is there reasonable grounds that would justify the limitations of the rights in Section 12? Wayne, please unmute for us if you can. Thank you.
Yes. So, as the epidemiologist explained, there is a clear public interest in protecting public health, and the limitation clause requires that legislation limit a particular right in a reasonable and justifiable way in an open and democratic society, in a way that that limitation is non-intrusive and there are no other measures. And the courts, although they haven't obviously ruled on this COVID issue and making COVID vaccines mandatory, they have in the past decided on 2 cases that also involve public health and ruled that that the public health concern outweighed Section 12 before. And as long as the data from the scientists indicates that the vaccines will save lives and are a way to move us out of this public health situation, then it is likely that it will be reasonable and justifiable. However, will be contested are individual policies that companies will come up with. And I think the directive that has come out, which makes, I suppose, what you call dismissal a last resort, the counseling, the relocation, all the different measures that employees have to make before they get to termination, that will be the testing point to see have employees taken every other measure required. Plus also, I don't think you can simply apply a mandatory policy equally across the board. Each particular implementation of that mandatory policy will have to be tested on specific situations. For instance, people who can carry out their work from home, if they're then required to take mandatory vaccination, then that might not be reasonable. So we'll have to see how the courts interpret this. We obviously expect to see these matters end up in court, but just the general principle of Section 12 being limited for public health, the courts have already decided on this in the past, and they've decided positively.
Yeah, and so the importance and the purpose of the limitation comes into question here, and what would be the considerations?
So obviously, currently, the importance of the limitation is limiting the transmission of the virus in workplaces. And this is not only in terms of employees, because occupational health and safety says you must create a safe work environment for your employees, but also for all the people who interact with your business. And if your goal is to ensure that those employees and everyone who interacts with them does not get the virus and then spread it to their loved ones and spread it to the public, then that in itself is a justifiable reason to limit some constitutional rights. And yeah, as you said, intrusions of public liberty are perfectly allowed in our Constitution as long as it's for a good public interest, which this definitely is.
Yeah, but then the question that becomes a little bit of a dicey one is whether or not rejection of mandatory vaccinations in the workplace can constitute constructive dismissal.
Yes, and certainly the directive that's currently out does not allow that. And I think our speaker from the department, I'm sorry, I didn't get his name, made that clear, and that's what they will be checking for. So the Department of Labor will ensure that, will have to ensure that employees follow the directive, ensure that, A, there are exemptions for constitutional and medical grounds, and ensure that companies follow that policy to ensure if someone does then reject it, A, they're counseled, B, accommodations are made, C, if they can be relocated, they are relocated, and that that whole process happens with mutual respect. Whether or not making vaccines mandatory is the good public policy to push the country towards a high vaccination rate. That's a debatable issue. There's a lot of research which says forcing people is not the best way to encourage people. I think the government can do a much better job of dealing with all the misinformation that is going around and doing a better public information campaign so that people would voluntarily want to be vaccinated. And not a lot has been done in that regard. But the businesses also have to carry on, and businesses also have to abide by their obligations to create a safe work environment. And so the two things can happen concurrently.
Yeah. But Ntshalintshali, I mean, what do you do then in that particular case where businesses see vaccines as a safest way to get employees who otherwise right now have been working remotely to be back at the office, because that certainly will be the best way for them to conduct their business?
I think even in the current direction, it will not be easier to just get rid of people. Of course, some unscrupulous employers are doing everything to get rid of people, either constructive dismissal or just dismissal that does not follow any kind of regulation, with the hope that the employees will not be in the position either to take the employer throughout the justice system. So they will do everything. More so those who are unscrupulous, who want to get rid and deny workers' rights in any way. They can do everything. As been indicated that during the lockdown, over 60% of the employers were not in compliance with the legislation. So they will do everything in that regard. The biggest issue for us is that good employers will not be even thinking of forcing workers to take forced vaccination. They will be able to engage, and I think that's what the direction are also trying to do. Counsel people, talk to the people, and the majority of people from where we're coming from. That's why trade unions in themselves, they're encouraging that people, they're demanding a rollout of vaccination, because the majority of our members are keen to go and vaccinate. So why are we taking the approach that is likely to be very negative and to encourage people to be resistant when you've got other options that are available? So it is in that context that we oppose the question of forced vaccination as a principle in our view, not as a mechanism of getting people. In fact, government is not in a position, if you look to the number of people that has been vaccinated, not everybody is resisting. The number of people not being vaccinated is the inability of government to take vaccination to people, to encourage people to have a debate. We should be having a debate here about why it's important to get people vaccination rather than why people should be forced to be vaccinated.
Yeah. Tibor, what is government's position? I wonder if you are looking at it. One of the corporations in South Africa, Discovery, having put out its policy to say by next year that policy comes in place and some of its employees would not be able to access their buildings or clients even be able to do business with them. Right, Tibor, I don't know if you heard me there. All right, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll try and get that response there from the department on that particular situation. Come back, you're live with us tonight on In Focus, Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. The debate on vaccine passports and making the workplace fully vaccinated. A complex issue, of course, still being ventilated and soon, I'm sure, will be tested in our courts. Bheki Ntshalintshali of COSATU with us tonight. Farai Nyabadza, who is an epidemiologist. So we also had Tibor from the Department of Labor, having some challenges there with that connection. Seem to have lost him. We'll try and establish that connection with him again. We also have a human rights lawyer, Wayne Mube, talking to us and just outlining some of those finer details for us tonight as far as the vaccination is concerned. There have been, of course, instances, Farai, where people have had adverse reaction to the vaccines, and certainly that would be adequate grounds for certain employees to say, I would not want to take the vaccine because maybe I have other underlying issues. And the employers themselves have not taken enough time to familiarize themselves with those kinds of details. Who then takes the responsibility when an employee experiences those adverse reactions?
Thank you so much, Tabo, for your question. We have seen recently, of course, situations where people have reported having had some side effects or some reactions that are not favorable to them after having taken the jab. And this is one of the things that is actually addressed by whoever is trained to do the vaccination, that you are actually told that you're likely to actually have side effects. And some of the side effects are actually, laid out before you during that particular process. And it is actually, important that whenever one has taken a jab and has had side effects, they actually seek medical, help and medical advice. And I know legally, the government has put aside some kind of a mechanism to say if you can prove that the vaccination did cause, some kind of severe damage, then you can, seek compensation. And this is from my own perspective. This is what I've read about, and this is what I have heard, that the mechanisms are there to actually, report should you have had any injuries. Let me put it that way: injuries in cause due to the vaccination process itself. But maybe to add a little bit to what you were actually saying in terms of the vaccine passports, it is actually important to note that even if you decide actually not to vaccinate, sometimes circumstances may actually force you to actually get vaccinated. And when I'm saying circumstances, if your work requires you to travel globally, many times you might actually be left with no excuse, but you are forced to vaccinate because some of the requirements are actually that you enter certain countries when you are actually fully vaccinated, which is in itself one way in which we will be found, or we will find ourselves having to seek or having to vaccinate, sort of like in some kind of a
But would that in itself not generate a discrimination issue on the grounds, for example, of religious beliefs? And I don't know what, for example, people say we get vaccinated now anyway when we travel into certain countries for a particular type of fever. How that particular aspect is navigated?
Certainly there are questions around religious beliefs with respect to vaccinations. And what people need to understand is that actually vaccination is not actually a new thing. Every one of us who has got a child knows that your child cannot go to grade 1 unless they produce a vaccination card or some kind of a vaccination evidence of having gotten all the necessary vaccinations that a child should have. And for those of us who probably have traveled quite a lot in Central, East, and West Africa, you know that yellow fever certificate is a requirement for you to travel. And you cannot fly into South Africa if you don't have that particular certificate. And I see us going that particular route when it comes to this particular kind of vaccination, that in certain countries, it will be in the near future very difficult for one to get in there unless you are actually vaccinated. Yeah. For those who stand on religious beliefs, certainly their religion has to be respected, should they so wish not to vaccinate. And I'm sure they do have rights when it comes to choosing choosing not to get vaccinated due to what they believe in. They have that constitutional right to say no. But certainly in many cases, we find ourselves between, a hard rock and some hot place when it comes to making these decisions, especially when you actually have to travel into certain quarters and certain space.
Yeah. Tibor Szana, let's bring it in here on those two questions. One is a corporation that has already declared its vaccination policy in South Africa, that's Discovery, and whether
yes.
government is looking at that, Tibor. And two, that question that I put earlier on to Farai as well, who is held liable for employees who later experience adverse health effects according to the directives coming from the Department of Labor?
Is that a question for me?
Yes.
Okay, in terms of, look, if someone goes for a vaccination and they experience adverse health effects with that, it is indicated in the direction that the compensation fund will stand in for that. So it is recorded that the compensation fund is going to support that particular issue. Sorry, your first question?
The first question was around the corporation that has already declared its vaccination policy or mandate, shall I say. That is Discovery, who have said that they will not be accepting certain employees into their buildings or even doing business with some clients on the grounds of not having a vaccine certificate.
I think you're raising a very important point. We have such a matter currently where the employer has locked out some of its employees due to the fact that they don't want to be vaccinated. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to encourage employees to contact our provincial offices or our local Department of Employment and Labor offices, and we have 126 labor centers around the country. And in so doing, raise these issues where employers are, let's say, they are doing things outside of what the direction is saying. So I'm encouraging them to do so. However, should an employee be fired for any reason, they may obviously take that matter up with the CCMA. But in this particular matter, as indicated, we are finding ourselves in a situation where employers are beginning to say to inspectors as well, you're not vaccinated and therefore you cannot enter this particular workplace. I might caution those employers that hindering an inspector in the performance of his or her functions will render themselves open to a prosecution. And obviously this could lead to further issues. And from a legal point, we would naturally need to follow through with whatever is thrown at us as a regulatory body. So in this particular matter, there's the situation where workers are already being refused entry back into the workplace. And secondly, where inspectors are being questioned around this matter. From the inspectorate point, I've indicated what we will definitely be pursuing should that be the case, Tibor.
Yeah. And what will you do for them? What would you be able to do for the employees when they come to you?
In that particular instance, and obviously it's a good question, in such a matter, we will go in and we will see whether or not the employer has followed all the necessary processes and procedures. And if there is a contravention in any way with our legislation, depending on the type of contravention, we may decide whether or not we are going to take that matter up with our courts. So I would encourage employers to do what is recorded, and in addition to what you have in the direction is an annexure called Annexure C, which really goes and provides the type of guidance that employers need. Now, I'd like to add what I've said early on is that employers must consult with their trade unions where they are obviously in existence, and also with their health and safety reps and lean on their health and safety committees. These are structures set up not because we like having these things in place for no purpose, but they are there to assist the employers to comply. There's also compliance officers, which the employer was required to put in place, again, to assist the employer with managing what they have determined to be a requirement in terms of the plan that they developed after having developed a risk assessment.
Yeah. Wayne, COSATU keeps raising the question of you have not made vaccines available first, and easily accessible, and you can't really say people are not taking them up. Now, one of the requirements, of course, to a limiting of a right is to demonstrate that there has not been a lesser restrictive means that has been pursued to achieve the purpose. Could that be a solid ground to say, well, you can't really limit this particular right because, I mean, for example, incentives have not been pursued in their fullest kind of extent in South Africa to get people to get those jabs?
Well, it might be an interesting legal argument, although I'm not sure that that would be a successful one in the future, particularly now that the government has upped its rollout. Obviously, the government was criticized for the slow rollout of vaccines. What the directive also from Labour says is that employees must also make available access to the vaccine, whether it's transportation for employees. We know that it is now regularly accessible in most major cities. Obviously, you don't know what the situation is in more non-urban areas. So that kind of argument would have to be well researched, and I'm not sure if it would be a successful one. Whether or not you can argue you don't have access, or whether or not you can argue that government has not pursued less restrictive measures. And ultimately, the Health and Safety Act, which is really the vehicle for the mandatory vaccination in workplaces, is an obligation on employees and separate from the government's responsibility towards pushing the vaccine. So it has already shifted the burden to employers. And so if you are arguing that someone was challenging the directive saying the government hasn't done its job to push the vaccines, I don't think that will be particularly successful.
Ntshalintshali, we've seen, for example, in the minerals sector, the mines making vaccines available to their employees. Would that, in a sense, make that argument difficult for the unions to say, well, the vaccines are available in the place of work, and it's certainly an employee who's not taking up that vaccine?
If you consider that the mining sector, for an example, has taken the vaccination to the workplace, and I think they're doing a wonderful job, and they have not raised the issues of mandatory vaccination, because they know that if you talk to the people and you address your people correctly and you educate them, the majority of people will be voluntarily taking vaccination. So that is our starting point, that if you make it available, you talk to people, people will respond positively. Secondly, I want just to address the issue that the rep from the department is making. We understand, unless you can give us different information, that the producers of vaccines are taking no responsibility to what may happen if you take the vaccine. Secondly, government themselves are not taking any responsibility that when you go there, you get vaccinated, it may work in a particular way. You're going to be compensated for that. In the workplace, when it's referring to the compensation, is referring to what you may term it to be an abnormal sick leave, that you get vaccinated, you then get sick, then you have to go home, and then you need to be compensated, not on the ordinarily sick leave, but under the Compensation Act. It doesn't say that if you get vaccinated, you die because of vaccination, which is going to be difficult in any way to prove that you have died through vaccination, you have not died of any underlying causes. So we should not be giving information that is not correct. Thirdly, in relation to the employers, I mean, it's easier for the Department of Labor to say, if you prevent an inspector coming to the workplace, it's going to be just taking them to the court. He knows how long it takes to the court. One judge in the KZN we have had, out of the blue, he's making his own law. You can't come to my court without showing a vaccination certificate. All this is happening because government is not taking a responsibility and put it a legislation if they want to. They want the court to rule whatever way and to follow the court. It can't be that. Government has a responsibility to make policies. Let those policies be debated in a particular way. Even if you take the question of the yellow fevers, it depends on other countries. South Africa can go to many countries without a yellow fever. It's a certificate that is required. You can go to Kenya, you can go to in many other countries. So there is an element of judgment by those that you may come to them. If you are powerful and you have money and you are going to indicate that you are bringing businesses, they turn a blind eye to you in dealing with those things. In some of the countries, you get vaccination on your arrival. And we know vaccination, when you get it on your arrival, not 7 days before, is not effective. The point we're trying to make it here, in our view, is that we should be using the time to talk to people, to make them vaccinated voluntarily in dealing with those issues. To a degree, when you can say you've got 70% people volunteering, there are only few that are refusing, and they've got no reason to do that one. It is at that point, therefore, that we may have to come back and say, what do we do in order to ensure that we get people vaccinated? Trade unions, support vaccination. We support it. We demand it. But when it, Trump on other rights, that's where we've got some difficulties in supporting that kind of an approach.
We'll come back in a moment. Tibor, I want you to respond to those 4 issues raised there by COSATU, and then we'll wrap up this conversation and take your view. Back with you tonight on In Focus, Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. The conversation on vaccine passports and vaccine mandates becoming a global reality. However, South Africa still not making it mandatory for people in the country to get COVID-19 vaccines. However, we have seen employers and corporations taking that particular space and requiring their employees to be vaccinated. Tibor, the question being raised by COSATU, one is that there is no responsibility taken by vaccine manufacturers on adverse effects of the vaccine. There is no responsibility taken by government on adverse effects should an employee take the vaccines. Not only that, there is no compensation as far as they are aware, except for maybe compensation when you take leave.
Tibor, thank you very much for that question. I think maybe the whole issue around responsibility for vaccines and so on, and any outfall therefrom should be taken up with the Department of Health. I would hate for myself to comment on an issue that is really a Department of Health issue. I think as far as the compensation side is concerned, it is true that the issue currently is the whole thing around the vaccination and the possible illnesses that might befall someone who becomes ill after having had the vaccine. So I think that on this particular issue, again, I think what Mr. Ntshalintshali is emphasizing is the whole issue around awareness that needs to be increased in terms of the whole vaccination issue and what people are entitled to. So from our side, we'll definitely increase the level of awareness. We are definitely talking to our stakeholders and clients the whole time. we have definitely increased the amount of inspections that we are doing, and in those inspections we obviously educate as far as we go. We have, however, got a concern around the inspections we are conducting, in that the level of compliance remains extremely low. So the vaccination issue is something that we'll definitely also focus on. And when we do visit workplaces, we do ensure that we incorporate the shop stewards, amongst others, in terms of the inspections that we do at workplaces. So as far as the compensation side is concerned, I'll definitely look into that and ensure that we communicate further on this matter.
Wayne, the courts have previously, of course, ventilated on the issue of cultural differences and views that are genuinely held. They cannot be willy-nilly ignored. But how much weight is placed on those particular beliefs when it comes to a public health imperative such as this one?
I think a lot of weight is placed on that, and I think that's why the current directives specifically allow for those two grounds, one of them constitutional rights, one of them medical reasons. Part of those constitutional rights are religious and cultural beliefs, and if the objections are clear on those grounds, then employees will have to accommodate people. Obviously, I don't think that will mean that anyone can then just, so for instance, if everyone just starts saying I'm Amish, I don't think that will qualify, right? I think you would still have to show that your particular cultural or religious beliefs, this thing particularly contravenes your cultural or religious beliefs. It cannot just be a shield to quite a serious public health issue. But again, as things are set out right now, no one is being forced to necessarily take the vaccine. It's really a question of how employers will interact and show a safe working environment for their employees, and the measures that they'll be taking in terms of their risk assessment for the particular employees who would require vaccination, either because of their own comorbidities or because of their interaction and ability to transmit the virus. And so a lot of this, we will have to see how it plays out, A, in implementation in industry, but also B, in the courts.
Farai, for employers who are undecided at this particular point on whether to take that particular policy and make vaccination mandatory, but they are struggling with employees who are currently off site and they would like to have them back in the place of work, how would you advise them to approach this?
Thank you. My general feeling is that, many a times for one to agree to vaccination, it's a function of the understanding of the process. And in this particular case, I would urge maybe every employer to make their employees understand what this process is all about and vaccination is all about and what it is not about. Because if you get that information out, it is likely to assist in every employee to make a decision to be vaccinated. In this particular case, it is important to have the correct information out and to say it out there correctly to the employees so that they actually, the vaccine or the vaccination uptake will actually increase. So to me, it's a question of getting the right information out there. In fact, not only the right information, but correct information of what vaccination is and what vaccination isn't. And if that information is accepted, then anybody will be convinced to vaccinate.
Gentlemen, I appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us tonight on In Focus. That's Bheki Ntshalintshali of COSATU, Epidemiologist Farai Nyabadza, Tibor Szana from the Department of Employment and Labor, as well as lawyer Wayne Ngube there helping us in that conversation.